Hello everyone, welcome back. We continue today the series on Babylonia in those ancient Bronze Age times. And today we're talking of the chapter dealing with trades, houses, land, wages, and prices. Talking about the economy. Doesn't sound too interesting, but believe me, it's got some pretty interesting little details. So as usual, like, subscribe, all the rest of the stuff, you know what to do. And let's continue. Oh, and there's a link to the work in the description and most likely the pinned comment. Now let's begin. Babylonia, as we have seen, was essentially an industrial country. In spite of its agricultural basis and the vast army of slaves with which it was filled, it was essentially a land of trades and manufactures. Its manufacturing frame was remembered into classical days. One of the rooms in the palace of Nero was hung with Babylonian tapestries, did you know? Which cost 4 million sesterces, and Cato, it is said, sold a Babylonian mantle because it was too costly and splendid for a Roman to wear. The wool of which the cloths and rugs of Babylonia were made was derived from the flocks which fed on the banks of the Euphrates River, and a large body of artisans was employed in weaving it into tapestries and curtains, robes and carpets. They were woven in bright and variably colored patterns. The figures of men and animals were depicted upon them, and the bas-relief or fresco could be replaced upon the wall by a picture in tapestry. As for the dyes, well, they were mainly vegetable, though the kermes or cochineal insect, of which the precious scarlet dye was extracted, was brought from the neighborhood of the Indus. So, at least Ctesias states, in the age of the Persian Empire, and since teak was found by Mr. Taylor among the ruins of Ur, it is probable that intercourse with the western coast of India went back to an earlier date. Indeed, an old bilingual list of clothing gives Sindhu as the name of material, which is explained to be vegetable wool. In this we must see the cotton, which in the classical epic was imported from the island of Telos in the Persian Gulf, but which is, as its name declared, must have originally been the Indian plant. Now the looms and weavers of Babylonia are, as is natural, repeatedly referred to in the contracts, many of which moreover relate to the safe purchase of wool. One of them even shows us Belshazzar, the son and heir apparent of King Nabonidus, as a wool merchant on a considerable scale. The sum of 20 manes for wool, it says, the property of Belshazzar, the son of the king, which has been handed over to Idin Merodach, the son of Basa, son of Nur-Sin, through the agency of Nebo-Zabit, the servant of the house of Belshazzar, the son of the king, and secretaries of the son of the king. In the month Adar, February, of the 11th year of Nabonidus, the debtor shall pay the money, 20 manes. The house of, missing section, the Persian, and all the property of Idin Merodach, in town and country, shall be by the security of Belshazzar, the son of the king, until he shall pay in full the money aforesaid. The money which shall meanwhile accrue upon the wool, he shall pay as interest. Then follow the names of 5 witnesses and a priest, as well as the date and place of registration. This was Babylon, and the priest, Bel-Aki-Idin, who helped to witness the deed, was actually a brother of Nabonidus, and consequently the uncle of Belshazzar. The weight of the wool that was sold is unfortunately not stated, but if we consider that 20 manes was paid for it, well, there must have been a considerable amount. In the reign of Cambyses, the amount of wool needed for the robe of the image of the sun goddess Ar was as much as 5 manes, 5 shekels in weight. Wealthy landowners kept large flocks of sheep, chiefly for the sake of their wool. Their prices varied greatly. Thus, in the 4th year of Nabonidus, 6 shekels were given for a sheep, while in the 13th year of the very same king, 18 sheep only fetched 35 shekels. Not very much. Well, in the 1st year of Cyrus, 6 lambs were sold for 8.5 shekels, and 5 other lambs for 7.5 shekels, while 1 sheep cost only 1 shekel and a quarter. In his 6th year, the price of a single sheep had risen to 4 shekels. Under Cambyses, we find sheep selling for 7 and 7.25 shekels apiece. In the 8th year of Nabonidus, 100 sheep were sold for 50 shekels after they had been slaughtered. It is clear, therefore, that the dead animal was considered less valuable than the living one. On the other hand, sheep cost a good deal to feed when the grazing season was over, and they had to be fed in the stall. A document dated in the 7th year of Cyrus states that 32 sheep required each day 1 pai, or 28 cars, being about 95 quarts of grain, while 160 full-grown animals consumed daily 1 pai, 16 cars, or more than 240 quarts. In the reign of Cambyses, 1 pai, 4 cars of fodder were needed daily for 20 old sheep, 100 cars for 100 younger sheep, and the same amount also for 200 lambs. At this time, 2 pai of grain cost 6.5 shekels. Consequently, the cost of keeping sheep, 20 old sheep alone, was about 10 shekels a day. To this had to be added the wages of the shepherds, of course, who were free Bedouin. Hence, it is not wonderful that the owner demanded 7 shekels for the sheep that he had to sell. In the Aidin, or field, however, their keep came but to little. The pasturage was common property, and it was only the wages of the Aramean shepherds who looked after the flock, which involved an outlay. The 5 shepherds who, in the 10th year of Nabonidus, were paid for their services by the overseer of the royal flocks in the town of Ruzabu, received 30 shekels of silver and a gur of grain. The gur contained 180 cars, and since in the 1st year of Cyrus 2 men received 2 pai, 30 cars, or 102 cars of grain for their support, during a month of 30 days, we may perhaps infer that the wages were intended to cover the 3rd part of a month. In this case, each man would have been paid at the rate of 9 shekels a month. It is, however, possible that the wages were really intended for the full month. The ancient Greeks considered a quart of wheat a sufficient daily allowance for a full-grown man, and 180 cars would mean about a quart a day for each man. We may gather from a contract dated from the 5th of Sivan in the 18th year of Darius that it was not customary to pay for any sheep that were sold until they had been driven into the city, the cost of doing so being included in the price. The contract is as follows: 100 sheep of the house of Akabtum, the mother of Sa-Bel-Idin, the servant of Bel-Sunu, that had been sold to La Bel, the son of Cabdea, on the 10th day of the month of Ab in the 18th year of Darius the king. The sheep, 200 in number, must be brought into Babylon and delivered to Supesu, the servant of Sa-bel-Idin. If 15 manes of silver are not paid for the sheep on the 10th of Ab, they must be paid on the 20th of the month. If the money amounting to 15 manes is not paid, then interest shall be paid according to this agreement at the rate of 1 shekel for each mane per month. Then come the names of the 8 witnesses, and a priest, the date, and the place of registration, which was a town called Siku. Now the contract is interesting from several points of view. The sheep, it will be seen, belonged to a woman, and not her son, who was the servant of a Babylonian gentleman, and had another servant who acted as his agent at Babylon. The father of the purchaser of the sheep bears the Hebrew name of Abdi, which transcribed into Babylonian in the usual fashion, and the name of the purchaser himself, which may be translated, "There is no bell," may imply that he was actually a Jew. Akabtum and her son were doubtless Aramaeans, and it is noticeable that the latter is termed a servant and not a slave. Before entering the city, an octroi duty had to be paid upon the sheep, as upon other produce of the country. The customs house was at the gate, and the duty is accordingly called gate money in the contracts. In front of the gate was an open space, called the revit, such as may still be seen at the entrance of an old oriental town, which was used as a marketplace. The revit of Nineveh lay on the north side of the city, in the direction where Sargon had built his palace, the ruins of which are now known as Khorsabad. But besides the marketplace outside the walls, there were also open spaces inside them, where markets could be held and sheep and cattle could be sold. Babylon, it would seem, was full of such public squares, and so too was Nineveh. The suki, or streets, led into them, long narrow lanes through which a chariot or cart could be driven with difficulty. Here and there, however, there were streets of a broader and better character called suli, which originally denoted the raised and paved ascents which led to a temple. It was along these that religious processions were conducted, and the king and his generals passed over them in triumph after a victory. One of these main streets, called A-ibur Sabu, intersected Babylon. It was constructed of brick by Nebuchadnezzar, paved with large slabs of stone, and raised to a considerable height. It started from the principal gate of the city, and after passing Es-Agil, the great temple of Bel-Merodach, was carried as far as the sanctuary of Ishtar, when Ashurbanipal's army captured Babylon after a long siege, the mercy seats of the gods, and the paved roads were cleansed by order of the Assyrian king and the advice of the prophets, while the ordinary streets and lanes were left to themselves. It was in these later streets, however, that the shops and bazaars were situated. Here the trade of the country was carried on in shops which possessed no windows, but were sheltered from the sun by awnings that were stretched across the street. Behind the shops were magazines and storehouses, as well as rooms in which the larger industries like that of weaving were carried on. The scavengers of the streets were probably dogs. As early as the time of Hammurabi, however, there were officers termed Rabbiani, whose duty it was to look after the city walls and the streets. The streets, moreover, had separate names. Here and there, beer houses were to be found, answering to the public houses of today, as well as regular inns. The beer houses are not infrequently alluded to in the texts, and a deed relating to the purchase of a house in Sippara of the age of Hammurabi mentions one that was in a sort of underground cellar, like some of the modern beer houses of Germany. Sippara lay on both sides of the Euphrates, like Babylon, and its two halves were probably connected by a pontoon bridge, as we know was the case at Babylon. Tolls were levied for passing over the latter, and probably also for passing it under boats. Passing under it in boats, rather. At all events, a document translated by Mr. Pinchers shows that the key duties were paid in the same department of the government as the tolls derived from the bridge. The document, which is dated in the 26th year of the reign of Darius, is so interesting that it might be quoted in full. The revenue derived from the bridge and the quays and of the guardhouse, which is under the control of Guzanu, the captain of Babylon, of which Sirku, the son of Edina, has charge, besides the amount derived from the tolls levied at the bridge of Guzanu, the capital of Babylon, of which Muranu, the son of Nebo-kin-Abli, and Nebo-Buladisu, the son of Guzanu, have charge. Karitsanu and Ikuba and Nergal-Ibni are the watchmen of the bridge. Sirku, the son of Edina, the son of Egibi, and Muranu, and the son of Nebo-kin-Abli, the son of the watchman of the pontoon, have paid to Bel-Asua, the son of Nergal-Ubal-Id, the son of Mudamik-Rimon and Ubartu, the son of Bel-Akdi-Erba, the son of the watchman of the pontoon, as dues for a month 15 shekels of white silver, and 1 shekel pieces and coined. Bel-Asua and Ubaru shall guard the ships which are moored under the bridge. Muranu and his trustees, Bel-Asua and Ubaru, shall not pay the money derived from these tolls levied at the bridge, which is due each month from Sirku in the absence of the latter. All the traffic over the bridge shall be reported by Bel-Asua and Ubaru to Sirku and the watchman of the bridge. House property was valuable, especially if it included shops. As far back as the reign of Eriaku, or Arish, 2¼ shekels were given for one who stood on a piece of ground only 1 sar in area. The sar, if Dr. Reisner is right, being the 1800th part of the fedan, or acre. In the 20th year of Ashurbanipal, just after a war which had desolated Babylonia, a house was sold in the provincial town of Erech for 75 shekels, and in the beginning of the reign of Nabonidus, a carpenter's shop in Boisipa, the suburb of Babylon, which was not more than 7 rods 5 cubits and 18 inches in length, was bought by the agent of the Syrian Ben-Hadad-Nethan and his wife for 11½ manes. On the other hand, in the reign of Cambyses, we hear of smaller prices being given for houses in Babylon, 4½ manes for a house with a piece of land attached to it, and 2 manes for one that had been given as joint property to a man and his wife, while in the 9th year of Nergal-Sharazar, a house was sold for only 52½ shekels. Houses, however, were more frequently rented than they were sold. Already in the age of Hammurabi we have the record of the lease of a house for 8 years. At a later date, contracts relating to the renting of houses are numerous. Thus, in the 6th year of Cyrus, a house was let at a yearly rent of 10 shekels, part of which was to be paid at the beginning of the year, and the rest in the middle of it. The tenant was to renew the fences when necessary and repair all dilapidations. He was also expected to send a present to his landlord thrice a year in the months of Nisan, Tammuz, and Kislev. Other houses in Babylon in the Persian age were let at yearly rents of 5 shekels, 5.5, all the way up to 35 shekels, with leases running from 2 to up to 10 or more years. The tenant usually undertook to keep the property in repair and make good all dilapidations. Loss in case of fire and other accidents also fell upon him. Most of the houses seem to have been inhabited by single families, but there were tenements or flats as well, the rent of which was naturally lower than that of a whole house. Thus, we find a woman paying only 2 shekels a year for a tenement in the reign of Cambyses. Any violation of the lease involved a fine, the amount of which was stated in the contract. A house, for instance, was let at Babylon in the first year of Cambyses for 5 shekels a year, the rent to be paid in 2 halves at the beginning and the middle of the year. In this case, a breach of contract was to be punished by a fine of 10 shekels, or double the amount of rent. In other cases, the fine was as much as a manet of silver. Occasionally, the primitive custom was retained of paying the rent in kind instead of in coin. We even hear of 6 overcoats being taken in lieu of rent. The rent of a house might also take the place of interest upon a loan, and the property be handed over to the creditor as security for a debt. Thus, in the second and last year of the reign of Evil-Merodach, 560 BC, and on the 4th of the month Ab, the following agreement was drawn up at Babylon. 4 manets of silver belonging to Nadin-Aki, the son of Nur-A, the son of Masduku, received at Sapik-Zeri, the son of Merodach-Nazir, the son of Leo-Merodach. The house of Sapik-Zeri, which is in the street Kuburu and adjoins the houses of Rimut-Bel, the son of Zeriah, the son of the Egyptian, and of Zeriah, the son of Bel-Ederu, shall be handed over as security to Nadin-Aki. No rent shall be paid for it, and no interest demanded for the debt. Sapik-Zeri will have it there for 3 years. He must renew the fences and repair all injuries to the walls. At the end of the 3 years, Sapik-Zeri shall repay the money, namely 4 manes, to Nadin-Aki, and the latter shall vacate the house. The rent of the warehouse of the eunuch is included, of which Sapik-Zeri enjoys the use. Whatever doors Nadin-Aki may have added to the house during his tenancies, he shall take away. Then come the names of 3 witnesses, one of them being the brother of the creditor, as well as of the clerk who drew up the document. Now, a few years later, in the 5th year of Nabonidus, 551 BC, we find the heir apparent, Belshazzar, receiving house property on similar terms. It reads like this. The house of Nebo-Aki-Idin, the son of Sula, the son of Egibi, which adjoins the house of Bel-Idin, the son of Birut, the son of the life guardsman, is handed over for 3 years as security for a loan of 1.5 manes to Nebo-Kin-Aki, the agent of Belshazzar, the son of the king, on the following conditions. No rent shall be paid for the house, and no interest paid on the debt. The tenant shall renew the fences and make good all dilapidations. At the end of 3 years, the 1.5 manes shall be paid by Nebo-Aki-Idin to Nebo-Kin-Aki, and Nebo-Kin-Aki shall vacate the house of Nebo-Aki-Idin, witnessed by Kab-Tia, the son of Tarnea, the son of Egibi, by Sapik Zeri, the son of Nergal-Yukin, the son of Sin-Karab-Seme, by Nebo-Zer-Ibni, the son of Ardia, and the clerk Bel-Aki Ikisa, the son of Nebo-Balasu-Ikbi at Babylon, 21st day of Nisan, in the 5th year of Nabonidus, the king of Babylon. This was not the only transaction of the kind of which Belshazzar appears, though it is true that his business was carried on by means of agents. 6 years later, we have another contract relating to his commercial dealings, which has already been quoted above. It illustrates the intensely commercial spirit of the Babylonians, and we may form some idea of the high estimation in which trade was held when we see the eldest son of the reigning king acting as a wool merchant and carrying on a business just like an ordinary merchant would. There is an interesting document drawn up in Babylonia in the 11th year of Sargon, 710 BC, shortly after the overthrow of Merodach-Baladan. It contains an account of a lawsuit which resulted from the purchase of 2 ruined houses in Dur-Ilu, a town on the frontier of Elam. They had been purchased by a certain Nebo-Liu for 85 shekels, with the intention of pulling them down and erecting new buildings on the site. In order to pay the purchase money, Nebo-Liu demanded back from Bel-Usatu, the son of Ipunu, the sum of 30 shekels, which he claimed to have lent him. Bel-Usatu at first denied the claim, and the matter was brought into the court. There, judgment was given in favor of the plaintiff, and the defendant was ordered to pay him 45 shekels, or half the amount claimed, being for costs, as quoted by the document. Thereupon, Bel-Usatu proposed, "Instead of the money, take my houses, which are in the town of Der. The title deeds of these houses, the longer side of which was bounded to the east by the house of Bay, the son of Sula, and to the west the entrance of a field which partially belonged to the property, whilst the shorter side was bounded to the north by the house of Itabsi, and to the south the house of Likima, were signed and sealed by Nebo-Usatu, who pledged himself not to retract the deed or make any subsequent claim, and they were then handed over to Nebo-Liu. Now, the troubles of the latter, however, were not yet at an end. It continues on. Ilu Rabu Bel Sanat Sennacherib and Lebasu, the sons of Rakaz, the priest of the great god, said to Nebo-Liu, 73 shekels of your money you have received from our father. Give us therefore 50 shekels, and we will deliver to you the house and its garden which belonged our father. The house, which was fit only to be pulled down and rebuilt, along with a grove of 40 date-bearing palms, was situated on the bank of the canal of Dutu in Dur-Ilu, its longer side adjoining on the north the house of Ederu, the son of Banya, the priest of Ar, and on the south of the canal of Dutu, while its shorter side was bounded on the east by the house of Nergal-Epus, and on the west by the street Mutakutu. Nebo-Liu agreed, and looked out and gave Rakaz and his sons 50 shekels of silver, together with an overcoat and 2 shekels by way of a bakshish to bind the bargain, the whole amounting to 52 shekels paid in full. Now, the custom of adding a bakshish, or present, gift, so to speak, to the purchase money at the conclusion of a bargain is still characteristic of the East to this very day. Other examples of it are met with in the Babylonian contracts, and prove how immemorially old it actually is. Thus, in the 2nd year of Darius, when the 3 sons of a smith sold a house near the gate of Zamama at Babylon to the grandson of another smith, Besides the purchase money for the house, which amounted to 67.5 shekels, the buyer gave in addition a bakshish of 2.5 shekels, as well as a dress for the lady of the house. I'm sure she was thrilled about that. Well, 3 shekels were given as a present for sealing the deed. So too, the negotiations for the sale of some land in the second year of Evil Merodach were accompanied by a bakshish of 5 shekels. Lawsuits connected with the sale or lease of houses don't seem to have been very uncommon. One of the documents which have come down to us from the ancient records of Babylon is a list of the judges before whom Sapik Zeri, the son of Zerutu, and Beladu, the son of Nasikatum, the slave of the secretary for the marshlands, catchy title, were called upon to appear in suit relating to the house and deed which Zerutu, the father of Sapik Zeri, had sealed and given to Beladu, who had afterwards handed both of them over to Sapik Zeri. Among the judges, we find the governor of the marshlands, who acted as president, the sub-governor, the mayor of Erech, and the priest of Ur, and of the governors of the district beyond the Euphrates. Now the list is dated the 6th of Nisan, or March, in the 17th year of Nebuchadnezzar. The value of land, of course, was proportionate to that of house property. In the early days of Babylon, its value was fixed by the amount of grain that could be grown upon it, and it was accordingly in grain that the owner was paid by the purchaser or leaser. Gradually, however, a metal currency took the place of grain, and in the latter age of Babylonian history, even the rent was but rarely paid in kind. We learn from a lawsuit decided in the reign of Samsu-Iluna, the son of Hammurabi, that it was customary for the estate to be paced around by the Rabbianim, or magistrates of the city. The ceremony was equivalent to beating the bounds of a parish in modern England, and it is probably that is where it's performed every year. Excuse me, it is probable that it was performed every year. Must be getting tired. Now, such at least is the custom in Egypt, where the limits of a piece of property are measured and fixed annually. The Babylonian document in which the custom is referred to relates to a dispute about the plantation of acacias which grew in the neighborhood of modern Tel Safir. The magistrates before whom it was brought are described as looking after not only the city but also the walls and streets, from which we may gather that municipal commissioners already existed in the Babylonian towns. The plaintiff made oath before them over the copper libation bowl of the god of boundaries, which thus took the place of the Bible in an English court of law. A few years later, in the reign of Zadok, 3 men rented a field for 3 years on terms of partnership, agreeing to give the owner, during the first 2 years, 1 gur of grain upon each fedan or acre. The whole of the 3rd harvest was to go to the lessees, and the partners were to divide the crop in equal shares on the day of the harvest. Now, when we come to the 12th century BC, however, the money and shekel have been substituted for crops of the field. Thus we hear of 704 shekels, and a fraction being paid for a field which was calculated to produce 3 gur of corn, and 110 shekels being given for another estate which contained a grove of date palms, and on which 2 gur of grain was sown. How much grain could be grown on a piece of land we can gather from the official reports of the cadastral survey. In the 6th year of Cyrus, for example, the following report was drawn up of the measurement of a corn field and corn in the ear belonging to a Babylonian taxpayer. being the length of the field on its long side, 1020 by 540, and on its narrow 395 by 550. Now, the cadastral survey for this purpose of taxation went back to an early period of Babylonian history. It was already at work in the age of Sargon of Akkad. The survey of the district or principality of Lagash, which is now known as Telo, was drawn up in that remote epic of history, is now in our hands, and is an interesting account of its reference to a governor of the land of the Amorites or Canaan, who bears the Canaanitish name Urimelech. The survey states that the district in question contained 39,694 acres, 1,325 sar, as well as 17 large towns and 8 subdivisions. Another cadastral survey from Lagash, but of the period of Hammurabi, which has recently been published by Dr. Shale, tells us that the towns on the lower bank of the canal of Lagash had to pay the treasury each year 35 shekels of silver, according to the assessment of the tax collector Sin Mustal. I'm sure he was a popular man. Well, one of the towns was that of the Aramean tribe Pekod. Another is called the town of the Brewers, and another is described as the Copper Foundry. Most of the towns were assessed at half a shekel, though there were some which had to pay a shekel and more. Among the latter was the town of Ninna, which gave its name to the more famous Nineveh on the Tigris. The surveyor, it should be added, was an important personage in Babylon, and the contract tablets of the Second Babylonian Empire did not unfrequently mention his name. Now, Assyria, like Babylonia, has yielded us a good many deeds relating to the sale and lease of houses and landed estate. We can estimate from them the average value of house property in Nineveh in the time of the Second Assyrian Empire, when the wealth of the Eastern world was being poured into it, and the Assyrian kings were striving to divert the trade of Phoenicia into their own hands. Thus, in 694 BC, a house with 2 doors was sold for 3 manes, 20 shekels, and 2 years subsequently another which adjoined it was purchased for 1 mane, in quotes on the contract, according to the royal standard. Ooh. Well, the contract for the sale is a good example of what an Assyrian deed of sale in such a case was like, and it goes like this. The nail marks of Sar Ludari, Akasuru, and Amat Sula, the wife of Belsuri the official, the son of the priest and owner of the house which is sold. The house, which is in thorough repair, with its woodwork, doors, and court, situated in the city of Nineveh and adjoining the houses of Manuki, Aki, and Iluitia in the street Sibru, has been negotiated for by Zil Ashur, the Assyrian secretary. He has bought it for 1 mane of silver, according to the royal standard, from Sar Iudari, Akasuru, and Amat Sula, the wife of Belduri. The money has been paid in full, and the house received as bought. Withdrawal from the contract, lawsuits, and claims are hereby excluded. Whoever hereafter at any time, whether these men or others, shall bring an action and claims against Zil Asur shall be fined 10 manes of silver. Witnessed by Susanku Katanis, Mulmasa the official, Rasu the sailor, Mulmasa the naval captain, Sinsar Uzur, and Zedekiah Zitka. The 16th of Sivan, during the year of office of Zaza, the governor of Arpad, 692 BC. It is noticeable that the first witness has a Syrian name. One of the characteristics of the Assyrian deeds is that so few of the parties who appear on them are able to write their names. Nail marks take place of seals, even in the case of persons who hold official positions and are shown by the contracts to have been men of property. In this respect, Syria offers a striking contrast to Babylonia, where the nail mark seldom makes its appearance. Closely connected with this inability to write is the absence of the seal cylinder, which was part of the ordinary dress of the Babylonian gentleman, as we have mentioned. Now, in the Assyrian contracts, on the other hand, it is conspicuous by its absence. The use of it in Assyria was an imitation of Babylonian manners, and was confined for the most part to the scribes and higher official class, who had received a literary education. Land in Assyria was measured by homers, rather than by fedans or acres, as we mentioned in Babylonia. In 674 BC, an estimate of 35 homers in the town of Sairi was sold for 5 manes, an infringement of the contract being punished by a fine of 10 manes of silver or 1 of gold, to be paid into the treasury of the temple of Ishtar. We learn incidentally from this that the value of gold to silver at the time was 1 to 10. 5 years previously, 6 homers of land in another small Assyrian town had been let at an annual rent of 1 mané of silver, according to the standard of Carchemish. Now, in the reign of Ashurbanipal, a homer of corn land was rented for 6 years for 10 shekels per year. The land was calculated to produce 9 cars of grain, and at the end of the first 3 years it was stipulated that there should be a rotation of crops. About the same time, 2 fields, enclosing an area of 3 homers, were leased by a certain Rimu Anabel of Beth Abimelech, whose father's name, Yatanael, shows that he was actually of Syrian origin. The steward of the son of a king took them for 6 years at an annual rent of 12 shekels. One of the fields contained a well and yielded 15 cars of grain to each homer. It is stated in the contract that the fields had no mortgage upon them, and that the leasee had a right to the whole of the crop which they produced. Not a bad deal. Well, it was not in Assyria only that plots of ground could be leased and sold in accordance with the provisions of Assyrian law. Conquest had brought landed property into the hands of Assyrians in other parts of the eastern world, and it could be put up to auction at Nineveh, where the proprietors lived. About 660 BC, for instance, a considerable estate was thus sold in the oasis of Singara, in the center of Mesopotamia. It lay within the precincts of the temple of Ishtar, and contained a grove of 1,000 young palms. It moreover included a field of 2 homers planted with terebinths, house property extending over 6 homers, a house with a cornfield attached to it, and another house which stood in the grove of Yarku, the moon god. The whole was sold for 4 shekels of silver, according to the standard of Carchemish in the contracts, and the penalty for any infringement of the contract was again to be the payment of a mané of gold to the treasury of the goddess Ishtar. When one of the parties of the contract was of Aramaean descent, it was usual to add an explanatory docket in Aramaic to the deed of sale. Indeed, this seems to have been sometimes done even where there was no Aramaeans in the case, so thoroughly had Aramaic become the common language of trade. Thus, in the year of Sennacherib's office as eponym, around 687 BC, we hear of the sale of 3 shops in Nineveh on the part of a certain Dain Kurban, whose name is written in Aramaic letters on the outer envelope of the deed of sale. 30 shekels were paid for them, and a fine of 10 manes imposed upon anyone who should attempt to invalidate the sale. The shops seem to have been situated in the Syrian quarter of the city, as we are told that they were opposite the tenement of Nakharao, the man of Nahor. It will have been noticed how frequently is stated that a plantation or grove of palms is attached to the house or field which is rented and sold. In fact, in Babylonia, an estate was not considered complete without its garden, which almost invariably included a clump of palms. The date palm was the staple of the country. It was almost the only tree which grew there, and it grew in marvelous abundance. Stem, leaves, and fruit alike were all put to good use. The columns and roofing beams of the temples and houses were made of its stem, which was also employed for bonding the brick walls of the cities. Its fibers were twisted into ropes, its leaves woven into baskets. The fruit it bore was utilized in many ways. Sometimes the dates were eaten fresh, at other times they were dried and exported to foreign lands, and out of some wine was made, out of others a rich and luscious sugar. It was little wonder that the Babylonian regarded the palm as the best gift that nature had bestowed upon him. Palm land necessarily fetched a higher price than corn land, and we may conclude, from a contract of the 3rd year of Cyrus, that its valuation was 7½ times greater. Trade partnerships were common, and even commercial companies were not unknown. The great banking and money-lending firm, which was known in Babylonia under the name of its founder, Egibi, and from which so many of the contract tablets have been derived, was an example of the latter. It lasted through several generations and seems to have been but little affected by the political revolutions and changes which took place at Babylon. It saw the rise and fall of the empire of Nebuchadnezzar, and flourished quite as much under the Persians as under the native kings. As far back as the reign of Samsu-Iluna, we find women entering partnership with men for business purposes on a footing of absolute equality. A certain Amat Samas, for instance, a devotee of the sun god, did so with 2 men in order to trade with a manet of silver which had been borrowed from the treasury of the god. It was stipulated in the deed, which was indentured when the partnership was made, that in case of disagreement the capital and interest accruing from it were to be divided in equal shares among 3 partners. In latter Babylonian periods, the contract was drawn up in much the same form, though with little more detail. In the report of a trial dated in the 8th day of Sebat or January, in the 18th year of Nebuchadnezzar II, we have the following reference to one who had been made 21 years before. It goes like this. A partnership was entered into between Nebo-Yukin-Abla and his son Nebo-Bel-Sunu on the one side and Musazib-Bel on the other, which lasted from the 18th year of Nabopolassar, king of Babylon, to the 18th year of Nebuchadnezzar. The contract was produced before the judge of the judges. 50 shekels of silver were adjudged to Nebo-Bel-Sunu and his father Nebo-Yukin-Abla. No further agreement or partnership exists between the 2 parties. They have ended their contract with one another. All former obligations in their names are rescinded. One of the latest Babylonian deeds of partnership that have come down to us is dated in the 5th year of Xerxes. It begins with the statement that Bel-Ederu, son of Nergal-Ederu, and Ribata, son of Kasmani, have entered into partnership with one another, contributing severally toward it 2½ manets of silver in stamped shekel pieces, and half a manet of silver, also in stamped shekel pieces. Whatever profits Barter shall make on the capital, namely the 3 manets in stamped shekel pieces, whether in town or country, he shall divide with Bel Aderu proportionally to the share of the latter in the business. When the partnership is dissolved, he shall repay to Bel Aderu the 2.5 manets contributed by him. Barter, son of Kasmani, undertakes all responsibility for the money. Then come the 6 names of the witnesses of the contract. Now money, however, was not the only subject of a deed and partnership. Houses and other property could be bought and sold and traded with in common. Thus we hear of Iti Merodach Balad, the grandson of the Egyptian, as were alluded to in the contract, and Merodach Sapik Zeri, stating as partners, with a capital of 5 manets of silver and 130 empty barrels, 2 slaves acting as agents. And on another occasion, we find it stipulated that 200 barrels full of good beer, 20 empty barrels, 10 cups and saucers, 90 gur of dates in the storehouse, 15 gur of chickpeas, and 14 sheep, besides the profit from the shop, and whatever else Belsunu has accumulated, shall be shared between him and his partner. The partners usually contributed in equal parts to the business, and the profits were divided equally among them. Where this was not the case, provision was made for a proportionate distribution of profit and loss. All profits were included, whether made to the use of the language of Babylonian law, in town or country. The partnership was generally entered into for a fixed term of years, but could be terminated sooner by death or by agreement. One of the partners could be represented by an agent, who was often a slave. In some instances we hear of the wife taking place of her husband or another relation during her absence from home, during his absence rather. Thus, in a deed dated to the 2nd year of Nergal-Sharezer, 559 BC, we read, as long as Pani Nebo-Demi, the brother of Ili Kanua, does not return from his travels, Burasu, the wife of Ili Kanua, shall share in the business of Ili Kanua, in the place of Pani Nebo-Demi. When Pani Nebo-Demi returns, she shall leave Ili Kanua and hand over the share of Pani, hand over the share to Pani Nebo-Demi. As one of the witnesses to the document is a minister of the king, who bears the Syrian name of Salamanu, or Solomon, the son of Baal Tamuth, it is possible that Pani Nebo-Demi was a Syrian merchant, whose business obliged him to reside in a foreign country. That partnerships in Babylon were originally made for the sake of foreign trade seems probable from the name given to them. This is Karan, which properly means a road, or perhaps caravan. The earliest partners in trade would have been the members of a caravan, who clubbed together to travel in foreign lands and to defend themselves in common from the perils of the journey. The products of the Babylonian looms must have been among the first objects which were thus sent abroad. We have already described the extensive industry which brought wealth into Babylon and made it from its earliest ages the center of trade in rugs and tapestries, cloths and clothing. A large part of the industrial population of the country must have been employed in factories and shops, where the woven and embroidered fabrics were produced and made ready for sale. In fact, long lists exist giving the names of various articles of dress which were thus manufactured. The goodly Babylonish garment carried off by Akan from the sack of Jericho was but one of the many different one of the many which found their way each year to the shores of the Mediterranean. The trades of the dyer and the fuller flourished by the side of that clothmaker. So too did the trade of the tanner, leather being much used and finely worked. The shoes of the Babylonian ladies were famous, and the saddles of the horses were made with elaborate care. The smith, too, occupied an honorable position. In the earlier period of Babylonian history, gold, silver, copper, and bronze were the metals which he manufactured into arms, utensils, and ornaments. At a latter date, however, iron also came to be extensively used, though probably not before the 16th century BC. The use of bronze, moreover, does not seem to go back much beyond the age of Sargon of Akkad. At all events, the oldest metal tools and weapons found at Tello are of copper, without any admixture of tin. Most of the copper came from the mines of the Sinaitic Peninsula, though the metal was also found in Cyprus, to which reference appears to be made in the annals of Sargon. The tin was brought from a much greater distance. Indeed, it would seem that the nearest sources for it, at any rate in sufficient quantities for the bronze of the Oriental world, were India and the Malayan Peninsula on the one hand, and the southern extremity of Cornwall on the other, believe it or not. Well, it is not surprising, therefore, that it should have been rare and expensive, and that consequently it was long before copper was superseded by harder bronze. Means, however, were found for hardening the copper when it was used, and copper tools were employed to cut even the hardest of stones. The metal, after being melted, was run into molds of stone or clay. It was in this way that the most of the gold and silver ornaments were manufactured, which we see represented in the sculptures. Stone molds for earrings have been found at the site of Nineveh, and in the inscriptions contain many references to jewelry. A document found among the records of the trading firm of Murasu at Nippur in the 5th century shows that the goldsmith was required to warrant the excellence of his work before handing it over to the customer, and it may be presumed that the same rule held good for other trades also. The document in question is a guarantee that an emerald has been so well set in a ring as to not drop out for 20 years, and has been translated as follows by Professor Hilprecht. Bel Ak Idina and Bel Sunu, the sons of Bel, and Katin, the son of Bazuzu, have made the following declaration to Bel Nadin Sumu, the son of Murasu. As to the gold ring set with an emerald, we guarantee that for 20 years the emerald will not fall out of the ring. If it should fall out before the end of the 20 years, Bel Ak Idina and the 2 others shall pay Bel Nadin Sumu an indemnity of 10 manes of silver. Then come the names of 7 witnesses, and of the clerk who drew up the deed, and the artisans add their nail marks in place of seals. Many of the articles in daily use in the houses of the people, such as knives, tools of all kinds, bowls, dishes, and the like, were made of copper or bronze. They were, however, somewhat expensive, and as late as the reign of Cambyses, we find the copper libation bowl and a cup cost as much as 4 manes 9 shekels, and about the same time 22 shekels were paid for 2 copper bowls, 7.5 manes in weight. Now, if the weight in this case were equivalent to that of a silver manet cost, would have been nearly 4 per ounce. It must be remembered that, as in the modern East, the workman expected the metal to be furnished by his customer, and accordingly we hear of 3 manes of iron being given to a smith to be made into rods for bows. 3 manes of iron were also considered sufficient for the manufacture of 6 swords, 2 oboe rings, and 2 bolts. All of this, of course, belongs to the age of the Second Babylonian Empire, when iron had taken the place of bronze. The carpenter's trade is another handicraft for which there is frequent allusion to in the texts. Already before the days of Sargon of Akkad, beams of wood were fetched from distant lands for the temples and palaces of Chaldea. Cedar was brought from the mountains of Amanus and Lebanon, and other trees from Elam. The palm could be used for purely architectural purposes, for boarding the crude bricks of the walls together, or to serve as rafters for the roof. But it was unsuitable for doors, or for the wooden panels which the chambers of the temple or palace were often lined. For such purposes the cedar was considered best, and burnt panels of it have been found in the sanctuary of Ingurisa at Telo. Down to the latest days panels of wood were valuable in Babylonia, and we find stipulated in the leases of the houses that the leasee should be allowed to remove the doors he has put up at his own expense. But the carpenter's trade was not confined to inartistic work. From the earliest age of Babylonian history, he was skilled in making household furniture, which was often a highly artistic description. On a seal cylinder now in the British Museum, the king is represented as seated on a chair, which, like those of ancient Egypt, rested on the feet of an oxen, and similarly artistic couches and chests inlaid with ivory or gold. Well, these were often to be met within the houses of the rich, of course. Very rare to see them in the poor. The Assyrian sculptures show to what perfection the art of the joiner had attained at the time when Nineveh was the mistress of the civilized world. The art of the stonecutter had attained an even higher perfection at a very remote date. Indeed, the seal cylinders of the time of Sargon of Akkad display a degree of excellence and finish which was unsurpassed at any subsequent time. The same may be said of the bas-relief of Naram Sin discovered at Diarbakar. The combination of realism and artistic finish displayed in it was never equaled, even by the bas-reliefs of Assyria, admirable as they are from many points of view. The early stonecutters of Chaldea tried their skill upon the hardest of materials, and engraved upon them the minutest and most delicate of designs. Hematite was a favorite material for the seal cylinder. The statues of Tello are carved out of diorite, which has been brought from the Sinaitic Peninsula, and stones of similar hardness were manufactured into vases. That such work should have been attempted in an age when iron and steel were as yet unknown seems to us astonishing. Even bronze was scarce, and the majority of the tools employed by the workmen were made of copper, which was artificially hardened when in use. Emery powder or sand was also used, and the lathe had long been known. When iron was first introduced into the workshops of Babylonia is quite doubtful. That the metal had been recognized at an early period is clear from the fact that in the primitive picture writing of the country out of which the cuneiform syllabary developed, it was denoted by 2 characters representing respectively heaven and metal. It would seem, therefore, that the first iron with which the inhabitants of the Babylonian plain were acquainted was of meteoric origin. In the age of the Egyptian Empire in Asia, at the beginning of the 17th century BC, iron was passing into general use. Objects of iron are referred to in the inscriptions and a couple of centuries later we hear of iron chariots among the Canaanites and of ironsmiths in Palestine who repair the shattered vehicles of Egyptian travelers in that country. It must have been at this time that the bronzesmith in Babylonia became transformed into an ironsmith. Now, carving in ivory was another trade followed in Babylonia and Assyria. The carved ivories found on the site of Nineveh are of course of great beauty, and from a very early epoch ivory was used for the handles of scepters or for the inlaid work of wooden furniture. The ivory couches of Babylonia made their way to the west along with the other products of Babylonian culture, and Amos denounces the wealthy nobles of Israel who, I quote, lie upon beds of ivory. Thothmes III of Egypt, in the 16th century BC, hunted the elephant on the banks of the Euphrates, not far from Carchemish, and as late as 1100 BC, Tiglath-Pileser I of Assyria speaks of doing the exact same. In the older period of Babylonian history, therefore, the elephant would have lived on the northern frontier of Babylonian domination, and its tusks would have been carried down the Euphrates along with other articles of northern trade. Quite as old as the trade of the carver in the ivory was that of the porcelain maker. The walls of the palaces and temples of Babylonia and Assyria were adorned with glazed and enameled tiles, on which figures and other designs were drawn in brilliant colors. They were then covered with a metallic glaze and fired. Babylonia, in fact, seems to have been the original home of the enameled tile, and therewith the manufacture of porcelain. It was the land of clay, not of stone, and while it thus became necessary to ornament the plain mud wall of the house, the clay brick itself, when painted and protected by a glaze, was made into the best and most enduring of ornaments. The enameled bricks of Chaldea and Assyria are among the most beautiful relics of Babylonian civilization that have survived to us, and those which adorned the Persian palace of Susa and are now in the Museum of the Louvre are unsurpassed by the most elaborate productions of our modern skill. Our enumeration of Babylonian trades would not be complete without mentioning the being made of that of the brick maker. The manufacture of bricks was indeed one of the chief industries of the country, and the brickmaker took the position which would be taken by the mason elsewhere. He erected all the buildings in Babylonia. The walls of the temples themselves were of brick. Even in Assyria, the slavish imitation of Babylonian models caused brick to remain the chief building material of a kingdom where stone was plentiful and clay comparatively scarce. The brickyards stood on the outskirts of the cities, where the ground was low and where a thick bed of reeds grew in a pond or marsh. These reeds were an important requisite for the brickmaker's art. When they dried, they formed on a bed which the bricks rested while they were being baked in the sun. Cut into small pieces, they were mixed with the clay in order to bind it together, and if the bricks were burned in a kiln, the reeds were used as fuel. They were accordingly artificially cultivated and fetched high prices. Thus, in the 14th year of Nabonidus, we hear of 2 shekels being given for 200 bundles of reeds for building a bridge across a canal, and a shekel for 100 bundles to be made into torches. At the same time, 55 shekels were paid for 8,000 loads of brick. The possession of a bed of reeds added to the value of an estate, and it is therefore always specified in deeds relating to the sale of property. One, situated in Sappara, was owned by a scribe, Arad Bel by name, who had drawn up several contracts, as we learn incidentally from a document dated in the 7th year of Cyrus, in which Ardi, the grandson of the brick maker, agrees to pay 2/3 of the bricks he makes to Arad Bel, on the condition of being allowed to manufacture them in the reed bed of the latter. This is described as adjoining the reed bed of Bel Baladan and the plantation of the sun god. The brickmaker was also a potter, and the manifold products of the potter's skill, for which Babylonia was celebrated, were manufactured in the corner of the brick field. Here also were made the tablets, which were handed to the professional scribe or to the ordinary citizen to be written upon, and so take the place of the papyrus of ancient Egypt or the paper of today. The brickmaker was thus not only a potter, but the provider of literary materials as well. He might even be compared with the printer of the modern world, since texts were occasionally cut in wood and so impressed upon molds of clay, which, after being hardened, were used as stamps, by means of which the texts could be multiplied, impressions of them being mechanically reproduced on other tablets or cylinders of clay. Another Babylonian trade which must be noticed was that of the vintner. Wine was made from dates, as well as from grapes, while beer, which they called sikaru, was also manufactured, probably from some cereal grain. Mention is found of a wine that was made from sesame. The vine was not a native of Babylonia, but must have been introduced from the highlands of Armenia at a very early date, as it was known there long before the days of Sargon of Akkad. Large quantities of wine and beer were drunk in both Babylonia and Assyria, and reference has already been made to the bas-relief in which the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal and his queen are depicted drinking wine in the gardens of his palace, while the head of his vanquished foe, the king of Elam, hangs from the branch of a neighboring tree. A receipt dated from the 11th day of Iyar in the 1st year of Nabonidus is for the conveyance of 75 cars of meal and 63 cars of beer for the sustenance of the artisans. And in the 38th year of Nebuchadnezzar, 20 shekels were paid for beer, the amount of which, however, is unfortunately not stated. But 2 large, as it's stated in the contract, casks of new wine cost 11 shekels, and 5 other smaller casks 10 shekels. Moreover, the inventory of goods being handed over to the slave Kunatu in the 6th year of Cambyses includes 50 casks of good beer, which, together with the cup from which it is drawn, was valued at 60 shekels. Whether any grape wine was made in Babylonia itself was questionable. At any rate, the greater part of that which was drunk there was imported from abroad, more especially from Armenia and Syria. The wines of the Lebanon were specially prized, the wine of Kilbinu or Helbon holding a chief place among them. The wines, some of which were described as white, were distinguished by the names of the localities where they were made, or with which the vines were grown, and Nebuchadnezzar gives the following list of them. The wine of Izala in Armenia, of Tihimu, of Zimini, of Helbon, Amabanu of the Shuhites, of Bitkubati in Elam, of Opis in Bitani in Armenia. To these another list adds the wine reserved for the king's drinking, and the wines of the Nazahe and Lahu, and the Kabur. The wine was kept in wine cellars, and among the Assyrian letters that have come down to us, some are from the cellars of the king. In one of them it is stated that the wine received in the month of Tebet had been bottled, and that there was no room in the royal cellars in which it could be stored. The king is therefore asked to allow new cellars to be made. Of course, the various trades formed guilds or corporations, and those who wished to enter one of these had to be apprenticed for a fixed number of years in order to learn the craft. As we have seen, slaves could thus be apprenticed by their owners in this way, and become members of a guild. What the exact relation was between the slave and free members of a trading guild we do not know, but it is probable that the slave was regarded as the representative of his master or mistress, who accordingly became, instead of himself, the real member of the corporation. We perhaps have a parallel in modern England, where a person can be elected a member of one of the city companies or trade guilds without being in any way connected to the trade itself. Since women in Babylonia were able to carry on a business, there would be no obstacle to a slave being apprenticed to a trade by his mistress. Hence, it is that we find a Babylonian lady named Nubta in the second year of Cyrus, apprenticing a slave to a weaver of 5 years. Nubta engaged to provide the apprentice with clothing and 1 car, nearly 2 quarts of grain each day. As in ancient Greece, a quart of grain is considered sufficient daily allowance for a man. The slave's allowance would seem to have been ample. The teacher was to be heavily fined if he failed to teach the trade, or overworked the apprentice, and so made him unable to learn it, the fine being fixed at 6 cars, about 10 quarts. Any infringement of the contract on either side was further to be visited with the penalty of 30 shekels of silver. Now, as 30 shekels of silver was equivalent to about 6 cars of wheat at the time when the contract was drawn up, it would have cost about 1 shekel. Now, under Nebuchadnezzar we find 12 cars, or the third part of an ardeb of sesame sold for half a shekel, which would make the cost of a single quart a little more than a penny. In the 12th year of Nabonidus, 60 shekels were paid for 6 gur of sesame, and since the gur contained 5 ardebs, according to Dr. Opert's calculation, the quart of sesame would have been a little less than 1½ shekels. When we come to the reign of Cambyses, we have 6½ shekels being paid for 2 ardebs, or about 100 quarts of wheat. It must, however, be remembered that the price of grain varied from year to year. In years of scarcity, the price rose. When the crops were plentiful, it necessarily fell. To a certain extent, the annual value was equalized by the large exportation of grain to foreign countries, to which reference is made in many of the contractual tablets. The institution of royal or public storehouses, moreover, called sutume, tended to keep the price of it steady and uniform. Nevertheless, bad seasons sometimes occurred, and there were more consequent fluctuations in price. This was more especially the case as regards the second staple of Babylonian food and standard of value, being, of course, dates. These seem to have been mostly consumed in Babylonia itself, and though large quantities of them were accumulated in the royal storehouses, it was upon a smaller scale in the case of grain. Hence, we need not be surprised if we find that while in the 7th year of Nebuchadnezzar, a shekel was paid for 1 or 1/3 of ardebs of dates, or about a halfpenny a quart. In the 30th year of the same reign, the price had fallen to 1/25 per quart. A little later, in the 1st year of Cambyses, 100 gur of dates was valued at 2½ shekels, the gur containing 180 cars, which gives 2 per each car, and in the second year of Cyrus a receipt for the payment of the workmen of the overseer states that the following amount of dates had been given from the royal storehouse for their food during the month of Tebet. 50 gur for the 50 workmen, 10 gur for the 10 shield bearers, 2 gur for the overseer, 1 gur for the chief overseer, in all 63 gurs of dates. It was consequently calculated that the workmen would consume a gur of dates per month, a month consisting, of course, of 30 days. Now, about the same period in the first year of Cyrus, after his conquest of Babylon, we hear of 2 men receiving 2 pi 30 cars, 102 cars all up, of grain for the month of Tammuz, each man accordingly receiving a little over a car a day, the wage being practically the same as that had been paid by Nubda to the slave. On the other hand, a receipt dated in the 15th century of Nabonidus is for 2 pi 72 cars of grain, and 54 cars of dates were paid to the captain of a boat for the conveyance of mortar to serve as food during the month of Tebet. As salt and vegetables were also added, it is probable that the captain was expected to share the food with his crew. A week previously, 8 shekels had been given for 91 gur of dates owned by the city of Palakutam on the Palakupas Canal to the temple of Uru at Sippara, but the money was probably paid for porterage only. At all events, 5 years earlier, a shekel and a quarter had been paid for the hire of a boat, which conveyed 3 oxen and 24 sheep, the offering made by Belshazzar in the month of Nisan to Shamash and the gods of Sippara, while 60 cars of dates were assigned to the boatmen for food. This would have been a car of dates per diem for each boatman, supposing that the voyage was intended to last a month. Now, in the 9th year of Nabonidus, 2 gur of dates were given to a man as his nourishment for 2 months, which would have been at the rate of 6 cars a day. In the 32nd year of the same reign, 36 cars of dates were valued at a shekel, or a penny a car. In the older period of Babylonian history, prices were reckoned in grain only, and, as might be expected, payment was made in kind rather than in coin. In the reign of Ammi-Zadok, for instance, 3 homers, 24.5 cars of oil, though valued at 20.5 shekels of silver, were actually bought with white Kurdish slaves, it being stipulated that if the slaves were not forthcoming, then the purchaser would have to pay for the oil in cash. 1,000 years later, under Merodach-Nadin-Aki, cash had become the necessary medium for exchange. A cart and harness were sold for 100 shekels, 6 riding horses for 300 shekels, 1 donkey from the west for 130, 1 steer for 30, 34 gur and 56 cars of grain for 137 shekels, 2 homers, 40 cars of oil for 16 shekels, and 2 long-sleeved robes for 12 shekels, 9 shawls for 18. From this time forward, we hear no more of payment in kind, except where wages were paid in food, or where tithes and other offerings were made to the temples. Though the current price of wheat continued to fix the market standard of value, business was conducted by means of stamped money. The shekel and the manet were the only medium of exchange. There are numerous materials for ascertaining the average prices of commodities in the latter days of Babylonian history. We have already seen what prices were given for sheep and wool, as well as in the cost of some articles of household use. In the 38th year of Nebuchadnezzar, 100 gur of wheat were valued at only 1 manet, that is to say, the car of wheat was worth only 1/100th a part of a shilling. while at the same time the price of dates was exactly 1/2 that amount. On the other hand, in the 4th year of Cambyses, 72 cars of sesame were sold at Sippara for 6.5 shekels. This would have made that cereal worth approximately half a quart, the same price as that would have been sold in the 12th year of Nabonidus. In the 2nd year of Nergal-Sharezer, 21 strings of onions fetched as much as 10 shekels, and a year later 96 shekels were given for onion bowls for planting. Sheep in the reign of Cambyses fetched 7 and 7.25 shekels each, while 10 shekels were given for an ox, 22.5 for a steer of 2 years old. In the 24th year of Nebuchadnezzar, 13 shekels had been paid for a full-grown ox, and as much as 67 shekels in the 4th year of Nabonidus, while in the 1st year of Evil-Merodach, a cow was sold for 15. Clothes and woven stuffs were naturally of all prices. In the time of Nebuchadnezzar, a cloak or overcoat used by the mountaineers cost only 4.5 shekels, though under Cambyses we hear of 58 shekels being charged for the 8 of the same articles of dress, which was supplied to the bowmen of the army. 3 years earlier, 7.5 shekels had been paid for 2 of these cloaks. About the same time, 10 sleeved gowns had cost 35 shekels. The cost of bricks and reeds has already been described. Bitumen was more valuable. In the 14th year of Nabonidus, a contract was made to supply 500 loads of it for 50 shekels, while at the same time the wooden handle of an axe was estimated at 1 shekel. 5 years previously, only 2 shekels had been given for 300 wooden handles, but they were doubtless intended for knives. In the 6th year of Nabonidus, the grandson of the priest of Sippara undertook to supply bricks, reeds, beams, doors, and chopped straw for building the house of Rimut, for 12 manes of silver, or 108 pounds. The wages of the workmen were not included in the contract. Well, with these prices, it is instructive to compare those recorded on contract tablets of the age of the 3rd dynasty of Ur, which preceded that under which Abraham was born. These tablets, though very numerous, have as yet been little examined, and the system of weights and measures which they contain is but imperfectly known. We learn from them that bitumen could be purchased at the time at the rate of half a shekel of silver for each talent of 60 manes, and that logs of wood imported from abroad were sold at a rate of 8, 10, 12, and 60 logs per shekel, the price varying according to the nature of the wood, of course. Prices, however, as might expect, are usually calculated in grain, oil, and the like, and the exact relation of these to the shekel and manet is still to be determined. The average wages of the workmen can be more easily fixed. Contracts dated in the reign of Hammurabi and Amraphel of Genesis, and found at Sippara, show that it was at the rate of about 4 shekels a year, the labourer's food being usually thrown in as well. Thus in one of these contracts we read the following: Rimon Bani has hired Sumi Izitum for his brother as a labourer for 3 months, his wages to be 1 shekel and a half of silver, 3 measures of flour, and 1 car and a half of oil. There shall be no withdrawal from the agreement. Ibni Amuru and Sikni Annunit have endorsed it. Rimon Bani has hired the labourer in the presence of Abum Ilu, the son of Ibni Shamash, and Elisu Ibni, the son of Iglas Rimon, and Arad Bel, the son of Akuam. Then follows the date. Another contract of the same age is much of the same tenor. Nur-Rimon has taken Idiatum, the son of Ilikama, from Narumbani, to work for him for a year at a yearly wage of 4.5 shekels of silver. At the beginning of the month, Sebat, Idiatum shall enter upon his service, and in the month Iyar it shall come to an end, and he shall quit it. Witnessed by Beltani, the daughter of Araz-Zar. It will be noticed that, with the one exception to the witnesses, the document are all women. There was but a little rise in wages in subsequent centuries. A butcher was paid only 1 shekel for a month's work in the 3rd year of Cambyses, as has been noted, and even skilled labor was not much better remunerated. In the 1st year of Cambyses, for instance, only half a shekel was paid for painting the stucco of a wall, though in the same year 67 shekels was given to a seal cutter for a month's labor. Slavery prevented wages from rising by flooding the labor market, and the free artisan had to compete with a vast body of slaves. Hence, it was that unskilled work was still so commonly paid in kind, rather than in coin, and that the workman was content if his employer provided him with food. Thus, in the 2nd year of Nabonidus, we are told that the coppersmith Liblud received 7 cars, about 8.5 quarts of flour, for overlaying a chariot with copper, and in the 17th year of the same reign, half a shekel of silver and 1 gur of wheat from the royal storehouse were paid to 5 men who had brought a flock of sheep to the king's administrator in the city of Razubu. The following laconic letter also tells the same tale. Letter from Tabik Zeri to Gula Ibni, my brother. Give 54 cars of meal to the men who have dug the canal. The 9th of Nisan, 5th year of Cyrus, king of Eridu, king of the world. The employer had a right to the workman's labor, so long as he furnished him with food and clothing. Okay, certainly making our way through the series, aren't we? Before I go, I'll thank the top-tier patrons: Dark, Gary, Kimberly, Ember, Ben, Britt, Charles, Erin, James, Jeffrey, Melissa, Scott, Stark Factory, Wendy, Jaden, Sherry, Jessica, Christine, Sally, Katiana, Christine, Fazabo, Legitmus, Maverick, Susan, Dr. Neuro Nerd, Cameron, Alexander, Nicholas, Daniel, JR, and Charlene. Thank you very much, and I will see you in the next exciting episode. Good night, everyone. Lots of love to you all.